The weather on Halloween evening in Napa, California was perfect. The sky was clear and the air was cool without being cold. And all along Dorset Street, that year's most popular costumes were on display. It was October 31st, 2004, and the tree-lined neighborhood of small but pricey houses was a parade ground for pastel-colored princesses, black vampires, smiling yellow SpongeBobs, and Power Rangers in 6 different bright colors. Trailing behind and alongside these trick-or-treaters were parents who were shining their flashlights at the skull and bones and headstones planted in front yards and at the strings of orange lights around doorways. The whole scene was a snapshot of what made Napa such a desirable place to live. Located just north of San Francisco, the trendy city of 70,000 residents still had a small-town vibe. Spread out around it were miles of green hillsides, covered with the acres of grapevines that had made the Napa Valley the premier wine-producing region in the United States. And tucked inside of this agricultural wonderland, the city of Napa was both beautiful and safe. And on this particular Halloween night, if there was one house on Dorset Street that radiated that feeling of safety and warmth, it was number 2631. Barely 900 square feet in size, the olive green 1.5-story home with the white trim and the attached 2-car garage looked almost doll-sized. Hardly big enough for the 3 26-year-old women who had all moved in there together over the course of the last 9 months. 2 of those roommates, Leslie Mazzara and Adrienne Insania, had been busy all evening passing out big handfuls of candy. Their excitement about this first Halloween together in this little house could be heard loud and clear as they oohed and awed over the little visitors trooping past the effigy of a witch hanging from the outside porch ceiling to knock on the front door. The 2 roommates who greeted the trick-or-treaters, Leslie and Adrienne, and their third roommate, who was sitting in the living room behind them, could not have been more different. Even before she got her degree in engineering, Adrienne had always loved building things. And in keeping with her hands-on and matter-of-fact approach to life, she had no problem telling people what was on her mind. Leslie was a former beauty queen from the Deep South who moved with the grace of someone who had spent 15 years of her life taking ballet lessons. She also had so much natural charm and magnetism that the first time she had visited one of the most famous vineyards in Napa Valley, she had immediately been offered a job. 6 months later, and Leslie had been promoted twice to her current position as a sales coordinator at the winery named after the famous Hollywood film director Francis Ford Coppola. Even the children who were there to get candy seemed immediately taken with Leslie. From her always expertly applied makeup to her long southern drawl, Leslie had stood out from the crowd from the moment she had arrived in Napa just 6 months earlier. But the children weren't just seeing Leslie's striking green eyes and friendly smile. As one of Leslie's admirers had once said, when looking for words to describe Leslie's deeper beauty, it was like trying to describe a rainbow to someone who couldn't see. In contrast to Adrienne and Leslie's outgoing personalities, the third roommate at 2631 Dorset Street, 26-year-old Lauren Minza, was the quietest and the neatest of the 3 women. As the volleyball coach of the local community college, Lauren had no trouble yelling out encouragement and instruction to her students, but when it came to any sort of social confrontation, Lauren held back and usually just let Adrienne do the talking. Of the 3 women, Lauren and Adrienne had been the first to move into this rented house on Dorset Street. After graduating from California's Polytechnic State University in 2001, Adrienne had returned to her childhood home in Napa Valley and almost immediately got hired in as an assistant engineer at the Napa Sanitation District. It was there at the Sanitation District that Adrienne had met the person who would become her best friend, a contract supervisor named Lily Prudhomme. Through Lily, Adrienne quickly became part of a new circle of friends. A year or so later, at the start of 2004, Adrienne had met Lauren for the first time at a volleyball class they both took at Napa Community College. And in February, when Lauren found the little house on Dorset Street, she had asked Adrienne to move in and share the rent. As for Lauren, her social life had taken off on the day Adrienne had arrived at 2631 Dorset. In typical Adrienne fashion, Lauren's new roommate did not arrive alone. Right behind Adrian, carrying cartons and furniture, were Lily and her boyfriend Eric, and another friend named Ben, all of whom helped Adrian and Lauren settle into their new home. In the space of that one day, Lauren had been welcomed into Adrian and Lily's circle, and by the time all the moving boxes were empty, the whole group of them had been laughing and talking over pizza and beer. Leslie, the last roommate to arrive at 2631 Dorset Street, had walked into their lives 4 months after that pizza party. Leslie had actually been living right next door to them for several weeks, and in passing conversations, Lauren had felt an instant connection to Leslie. Lauren liked Leslie's sense of fun, and even more, Leslie's genuine warmth and interest in other people. So when Leslie's roommates made plans to move out, Lauren and Adrian invited Leslie to move in with them. Before long, the upstairs bedroom across from Adrian's was filled with Leslie's clothes, perfume, and makeup. Leslie's arrival had definitely changed the dynamic at 2631, but in a fun way. While Adrian had arrived at the little house with a tight but small circle of close friends, Leslie arrived with an army, not just friends, but acquaintances and more male admirers than she could even count. And those were just the people Leslie knew in Napa. Her phone was filled with contacts from her life in Georgia and South Carolina, including ex-boyfriends who still made regular calls to Leslie, hoping to rekindle an old romance. But despite her busy social life and being involved with at least 2 different men at the same time, inside 2631, Leslie had respected her roommate's expectation of privacy. For the most part, if any of them wanted to spend the night with a boyfriend, they did it quietly and very infrequently, or they spent the night at the man's house. But that October, Leslie had started breaking that unspoken house rule, causing the first and only real conflict among the 3 roommates. 3 nights before Halloween, on October 28th, Leslie and one of her dates had made so much noise in Leslie's bedroom that Adrian and Lauren decided it was time to call a house meeting. Lauren had dreaded what she expected would turn into an awful confrontation, something she totally hated, but with her amazing charm and tact, Leslie had managed to diffuse the situation. Before the women even sat down together, Leslie sent both Lauren and Adrian an email apologizing for putting them in such an awkward situation and costing them most of one night's sleep. The roommates' ability to resolve the situation with some simple rules about having men over, rather than arguing or fighting about it, had felt like a win for all 3 women. And by Halloween day, everything felt right again with the world. The handyman that their landlord hired was outside working on the house, and that afternoon, Lauren spent a few hours out playing soccer and running errands. Meanwhile, Leslie and Adrian, all strain forgotten, were busy in the kitchen together, making Halloween-themed cupcakes and planning the next big holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. By around 9 p.m. on Halloween night, nearly all the adults and trick-or-treaters along Dorset Street had all gone home, and the front door light at 2631 had been turned off, leaving the witch and the little patch of pumpkins in the front yard in darkness. Inside the small green house, the empty bowls of candy had been put away, and the 3 roommates were all looking forward to a quiet Sunday evening before the start of a new work week. Adrian was the only one of the women who had plans to go out that night. As she got ready to go visit her boyfriend, Christian Lee, who lived only a few blocks away, Lauren and Leslie settled onto the couch to watch one of their favorite TV shows. At 9:30 p.m., Leslie got a call on her phone and headed upstairs, where she would get another 2 calls, this time from the father of one of her ex-boyfriends that she'd left behind in South Carolina. Looking at the 2 calls come in, Leslie sighed and let them go to voicemail. She'd listen to them later, or not at all. Suddenly tired, Leslie called a good night down to Lauren, and a few minutes later, Leslie was in bed. Meanwhile, Adrian's visit with Christian had ended in an argument. Adrian was ready for the 2 of them to make a serious commitment to one another, but Christian was not ready. As Adrian left Christian's a little after 10 p.m. and began heading home, all she could think about was Lily. Here, Adrian was wanting more from her partner, Christian, while 4 months ago, her best friend, Lily, had moved in the opposite direction with her partner, canceling or at least delaying her plans to marry Eric. Letting herself through the door of 2631 about a half hour later, Adrian reminded herself that love was just not easy. And after saying hello to Lauren and her dog Chloe, Adrian made her way up the stairs to her bedroom, directly across the tiny landing from Leslie's bedroom. By 11 p.m., Lauren and Chloe were also tucked in for the night in Lauren's downstairs bedroom. Just a few minutes before, after letting Chloe outside in the backyard one final time, Lauren had done what the last person to bed always did. She'd made sure all the doors were locked, including the garage door and the back sliding door. Then she had turned out all the indoor and outdoor lights, glanced one last time around the cozy house she called home, stepped inside her bedroom, and closed the bedroom door behind her. 2.5 hours later, a little after 1:30 in the morning, Lauren woke up suddenly to a flash of bright light and a bark from Chloe, who was lying on the bed next to her. Outside her window, the motion sensor light attached to the garage had clicked on. Lauren waited, listening, but heard nothing. Turning back over in her bed, Lauren murmured to Chloe that it must have been a neighborhood cat out on the prowl. But just minutes later, Lauren found herself wide awake a second time, and this time it wasn't the outside light. This time she'd been awakened by a sound coming from inside the house. Shushing her growling dog, Lauren listened intently, and she heard quiet footsteps making their way up the stairs towards the second floor where the other two roommates were sleeping. Lauren's first thought was that Leslie must have broken their new house rule and invited a man over to spend the night, and that was him kind of sneaking into the house to be with her. Annoyed, Lauren did her best to quiet Chloe and go back to sleep. But just a few minutes later, at about 2 a.m., in the early morning hours of November 1st, Lauren heard the first scream. Lauren and her dog instantly bolted upright. It was obvious that that scream had not been from lovemaking. And a moment later, Lauren's confusion turned to panic and terror as she heard a second scream coming from upstairs, followed by the sound of a violent struggle in the room directly above her. Furniture being shoved aside, things falling on the floor, the stamping of bare feet and shoes. And then Lauren heard Adrian's voice raised to a shout, "Oh my God, please help, please help!" Without turning her light on, Lauren stumbled out of her bed. She opened the door of her room and took one step into the dark hallway. For half a minute, Lauren just stood there listening, paralyzed with shock and fear, until suddenly she heard the sound of the glass light fixture at the top of the second floor landing break, and then she heard pounding footsteps as the intruder seemed to fly down the stairs 2 or 3 at a time, coming directly towards her. Jolted into action by a huge rush of adrenaline, Lauren reached down, grabbed Chloe, and turned toward the back door of the house. But no sooner had she stepped through the sliding door onto the patio and out onto the cold, damp grass than Lauren realized her mistake. The backyard was completely surrounded by a 6-foot-high fence, with no way for Lauren to escape. Terrified, Lauren dragged Chloe with her into a thicket of bushes, and just above the thudding of her own heart, Lauren could suddenly hear, from inside the house, the clack of the wooden window blinds in the kitchen. The sound told her one thing: the intruder had not followed her into the backyard. They were somewhere in the front of the house where the kitchen was. And then, when the clacking sound stopped, Lauren thought she heard a window break. Whoever had been inside the house must have left. And then, in the sudden quiet, Lauren heard it again. Adrian's faint but desperate cries for help. A moment later, Lauren crawled out from the cover of the bushes, and then, feeling her way in the darkness, she re-entered the house through the back door, and as carefully and quietly as she could, she picked up the receiver of the kitchen phone to call 911. But all she heard was the beep, beep, beep of a busy signal. And in her mind's eye, Lauren pictured the phone upstairs, the receiver knocked off its hook during that terrible struggle she'd heard just a few minutes earlier. Lauren put the phone down, and then, taking a deep breath and praying she was right, that the intruder was gone, she tiptoed to the front of the house, turned, and then began to climb the stairs. She was careful not to touch the dark smears along the right side of the staircase that she knew were blood, focusing instead on the light that was coming from one of the bedrooms. Reaching the tiny landing, Lauren stepped around the broken glass light fixture on the floor and turned so she was looking through the door into Leslie's room. But before Lauren could even register the feeling of wet blood on the floor under her bare feet, Lauren saw Adrian. Her friend was crouching in a narrow space between the wall and Leslie's bed. But something was terribly wrong. Adrian's face and neck and arms were covered in blood. As Lauren rushed over to help her friend, Adrian made an effort to speak, but all Lauren heard was a long, gurgling breath deep in Adrian's throat. It was at that point that Lauren noticed something else. On top of the bed, in a pile of blankets and clothes, she saw the body of her other roommate. Leslie lay face down and motionless, with deep cuts all across her back and upper arms. Lauren tried not to slip in the blood as she backpedaled out of Adrian's room. Turning on the landing, Lauren ran down the stairs, she grabbed her cell phone out of her bedroom, and she punched in 911. By the time police and medical emergency vehicles had pulled up to the curb outside 2631 Dorset Street at 2:13 a.m., Lauren and her dog Chloe were still sitting inside of Lauren's car. Afraid that whoever had attacked her friends might come back for her, Lauren had grabbed her dog, jumped into her car, cell phone pressed to her ear, and driven up and down the street as she begged the emergency dispatch operator to send help, and did her best to describe what had happened. She said, "Both my roommates are hurt. I think they're dying." The first officers on the scene set up a loose defensive perimeter around the house. Before letting the emergency personnel inside 2631, 4 other officers, guns drawn, cleared the inside of the little house to make sure it really was empty, except for the 2 victims. The police, who had reached Adrian just before she died, later described the carnage in the upstairs bedrooms as the bloodiest crime they'd ever seen. Meanwhile, wrapped in a blanket and standing outside the house, Lauren told an officer trained in questioning victims of trauma all that she could remember about the attack, from the moment the light flicked on in the backyard to the calls she had just made to 911 operators. And as Lauren would repeat over and over again to police and later to the families of Adrian and Leslie, no. At no point had Lauren seen the intruder's face or noticed any details that would help police identify who had attacked her roommates. And no, Lauren had absolutely no idea who would want to hurt either Leslie or Adrian. By 2:30 a.m. on November 1st, the little house on Dorset Street, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape, was lit up in the glow of portable floodlights. Most crime scenes yield maybe 2 to 3 pieces of physical evidence, but over the next 2 days, the crime scene techs, who were now combing the inside and outside of 2631, would collect a whopping 71 pieces of evidence. Meanwhile, as small groups of neighbors began to gather together in the street, whispering to each other and calling out questions to the police, Napa Police Detective Todd Schulman was already giving the orders that would get the investigation going. The 4-year veteran investigator assigned officers to canvass neighbors and the growing crowd outside to see if anyone remembered seeing anything or anyone that night that was out of place or suspicious. And based on what Lauren had been able to tell police about her roommate's work, personal and social lives, the detective also ordered his team to start interviewing friends, coworkers, boyfriends, and acquaintances of the 2 victims. And by mid-morning, 7 hours after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, police would be knocking on the doors of Adrian's best friend, Lily Prudhomme, and Adrian's boyfriend, Christian Lee. Further away, at the vineyard where Leslie worked, her co-workers would also be questioned by police, and as police began gathering information about Leslie's social life, so would a long list of Leslie's current and former boyfriends. But even as police fanned out around Napa and began working the phones to trace Leslie's connections in South Carolina and Georgia, crime scene techs had already collected evidence that would wind up making a big cut in the possible pool of suspects. By Thursday, November 3rd, 4 days after the early morning double murder, the police knew that the killer was a male, a finding that ruled out the female half of the US population. Forensic investigators had been able to collect several critical pieces of physical evidence from the crime scene that would all contain samples of the killer's DNA. There was a packet of plastic zip ties, the kind that could be used to bind a person's wrists, that the killer had dropped just under the front window where they entered and then later exited the house. There was also a smear of blood that did not belong to the victims on the aluminum siding of the house near the window. And finally, police had found 3 cigarette butts in the front and backyard of 2631. DNA from all three pieces of evidence was identical, and it showed, without a doubt, that the killer was a man. Unfortunately, what the DNA did not reveal was the identity of this man. The DNA would turn out not to match the DNA sample that police had collected from Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, and when the DNA results were run through a nationwide database of more than 4 million known criminal offenders, there was no match there either. Although the police would not release this information to the public for another 2 weeks, the DNA results did clear any females, including Lauren and Lily, of any involvement in the murders. And even though Detective Schulman could not completely rule out the possibility that the murders of Adrian and Leslie were just the result of a burglary gone horribly wrong, the DNA results showing the killer was a man did support the investigators' emerging theory of the murder. The violence of the attack suggested the killer had a personal motive. And with Adrian's boyfriend off the suspect list, and given the number of men who had been close to or involved with Leslie, police began to focus on Leslie as the killer's prime target. And Adrian must have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness who had to be eliminated. Still, there was a second theory about these murders, a theory that would make this case even harder to solve, and one that was already keeping terrified residents of Napa awake at night. That theory was that the murders were the work of a serial killer, a person with no connection to their victims, a killer who might strike again at any moment or leave without a trace and continue to kill somewhere else. Within days of the murders, local security companies saw an uptick in the number of people in Napa County requesting the installation of alarm systems. And by November 9th, the day of Adrian's funeral, the 350 mourners who watched a video showing Adrian's progression through life from childhood to engineer were talking to one another in hushed whispers about a killer who could be lurking in every backyard. One day later, on Wednesday, November 10th, the city of Napa offered a $100,000 reward, money collected from local businesses, for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever had killed Adrian and Leslie. But despite the size of that reward, and despite the long list of potential suspects in the murder, most of them connected in some way to Leslie Mazzara, as November 2004 came to a close, police had still not made any arrests. And by December 2nd, 1 month after the Halloween night murders, Napa's police commander was offering a very sobering update on the investigation. So far, progress had consisted of what police figured out had not happened at 2631 Dorset Street. Investigators had ruled out domestic violence. They had also ruled out any gang-related connections to the murder, a lead that popped up when they found out that Leslie's father was serving back-to-back life sentences in Florida for his role in a murder conspiracy. Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, had also been ruled out as a suspect, along with that father of one of Leslie's ex-boyfriends who had called Leslie twice the night before she was killed, and the handyman who had been working on the roommate's house on Halloween day. But according to the commander, the lack of progress had nothing to do with a lack of effort on the part of law enforcement. In the days after the murders, several other high-profile agencies had joined forces with the Napa police. Those included a response team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Napa County Major Crime Investigations Team, the California Department of Justice, and a handful of recently retired local detectives who had been rehired to help investigate this case. And behind the scenes, police had collected DNA swabs from almost 200 men who had some connection with the victims, and investigators had conducted nearly 1,000 interviews across 8 different states. Still, it just wasn't enough. Standing up in front of a packed press conference, the commander of the Napa Police Department told the public that 1 month after the murder, law enforcement had nothing to indicate that they were going to solve this case, quote, today, tomorrow, or next week, end quote. And if anything, that prediction turned out to be a very big understatement. Because over the next 10 months, the only breakthrough on the case was the use of a new DNA analysis tool that allowed police to further narrow down their suspect pool. In addition to knowing that the murderer was male, police now knew with good certainty that he was also of Northern European descent with possibly blonde hair and blue or green eyes. But while this ruled out suspects of color, it wasn't enough of a break to lead police to their killer. In the meantime, as the investigation dragged on, friends of Adrian and Leslie tried very hard to keep the memory of these two women alive and to move forward with their own lives. In between candlelight vigils, fundraisers, and interviews with the media about Adrian and Leslie, there was only one bright spot. Inviting their friends and Adrian's family to join them, Lily and Eric got married in a celebration of life service at the big white Episcopal Church on 3rd Street in Napa. It would not be until the fall of 2005, almost a year after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, that investigators finally got the break they needed to solve the so-called Halloween homicides. After basically running out of options for kickstarting an investigation that had ground to a halt, the Napa Police Department had decided to go public with one of the details in the case that they had been keeping a secret. Holding back evidence is a common practice in investigations. Investigators like to use undisclosed information to help confirm whether a suspect actually knows details about the crime that have not been made public. It also helps police rule out false confessions. In this case, the detail related to the cigarette butts that had been picked up by crime scene techs in the front and backyards of 2631 Dorset Street early on the morning of the murders. In August 2005, 9 months after those cigarette butts were collected and tested for DNA, further analysis had revealed that the cigarettes themselves, Camel Turkish Golds, were very unusual. Not only did the cigarettes have distinctive markings around the filter, they had only been on the market for 14 months, and they were only sold in Napa by a handful of stores. A month later, on September 21st, in a last-ditch effort to jog the memory of anyone who might know a smoker of Turkish Gold cigarettes, Detective Schulman released the name and description of the cigarettes to the local media, calling the information an important new piece of evidence in the Halloween murders. And for one television viewer, that evening's headline story about these Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes immediately struck a nerve. Sitting in a house just 2 miles away from the place where Adrian and Leslie had been killed 11 months earlier, the viewer suddenly stiffened up in his chair and turned up the volume on the TV set. As the newscaster ran through the latest details in the murder investigation, the young man watching knew that he had information that could be vital to the police trying to solve this case. Leaning forward, the young man clicked through other news stations on TV to see if he could find out any more information on what police were calling a breakthrough. 5 days later, on September 27th, Detective Schulman got a call from the Napa police station. Someone had just walked into the station asking for a detective and said he had important eyewitness testimony related to the murders of Adrian and Leslie. Based on this person's information, along with follow-up interviews and additional investigation by law enforcement, here is a reconstruction of what police and forensic experts believe happened to Adrian Insania and Leslie Mazzara on the night they were killed. For the killer, Sunday, October 31st, 2004, was a day of terrible disappointment. And at that party, on that Halloween night, as the killer looked around the table at the people sitting there and playing cards with him, his feelings of jealousy, anger, and resentment just kept getting stronger and stronger. Those feelings were helped along by all the alcohol, 1 drink for every hand of cards he lost, and the killer was losing the game badly. By the time the killer had been driven back to his house, he was so drunk he had trouble standing up, and by the time he stumbled into the empty apartment, he couldn't even remember getting dropped off at his own front door. But sometime after midnight, after waking up from a short sleep, the killer was sober enough to make a plan for that night and early morning that did not involve going back to bed. Instead, the killer had decided to go confront at least one of the people that he held responsible for the emotional pain he was feeling. And on his way out to his car, the killer stopped in his garage and put together his murder kit, a packet of plastic ties secured with a rubber band, and a sharp knife with a 4 to 5 inch long blade. Then, just before hopping into his car and heading for his destination, the killer patted his coat pocket, making sure he had a pack of his favorite cigarettes, the only brand he smoked now, Camel Turkish Gold. 10 minutes later, when the killer arrived at the little house at 2631 Dorset Street, he parked the car across the street and turned off the engine. Before getting out, he sat for a while in the darkness, looking at the orange pumpkins on the lawn and the witch with the green face twisting from one of the ceiling rafters of the front porch. Then the killer opened the car door and walked across the street until he was facing the closed white garage door of 2631. Standing there quietly, he pulled out his packet of cigarettes and began to smoke, while he lifted his eyes to stare at the upstairs windows. When he flicked one of his cigarette butts out of his hand and into the grass, the sudden movement was picked up by a motion sensor and the backyard light suddenly turned on, temporarily blinding him. But even though this startled him, and he might have even considered turning around and going back home, he ultimately decided to continue with his plan. He moved from the white garage doors across the front lawn to the front door, where he gently tried turning the knob. But the door was locked. However, that didn't mean the windows were locked too. Taking out his knife, the killer stepped from the door over to one of the front windows. And sure enough, when he inserted the blade between the windowsill and the window sash, he could feel the upward give as he pried the window open. And once he was able to slip his fingers under the sash, it was easy to push the window open all the way, giving him plenty of room to crawl inside. On his way into the house, the killer didn't notice that he had dropped his packet of zip ties secured with a rubber band that had soaked up a sample of his sweat and DNA. Once inside, the killer let his eyes adjust to the darkness, and then he stepped a little to his right, towards the stairs that led to the 2 upper bedrooms. Once upstairs, the killer turned into Leslie's room first. Seeing the sleeping woman on the bed in front of him, he stepped closer and stared down at her. Then, raising his knife high in the air, the murderer brought it down with all his force directly into Leslie's heart. Leslie had time for one short scream before the killer raised the knife and stabbed her again and again. But that scream had been enough to wake up Adrian in the little bedroom across the hall. Switching on the light, she could see that someone, an intruder, was inside of Leslie's room. A moment later, and Adrian was out of bed and stepping through the open door across the hallway to help her friend and roommate. The killer looked up, locked eyes with Adrian, and then he attacked, striking her with the knife. And when Adrian fought back, the killer struck again and again and again, leaving cuts and wounds all over her upper body, arms, and hands, along with a deep gash across her face and neck. The frenzied attack had left blood everywhere, in pools on the floor and spatter marks along the walls and the bed. But from the very start of their struggle, Adrian had begun to shout and call out for help, and she did not stop. And even as Adrian began to bleed out, her cries were so loud that the killer panicked. Running out of the bedroom, he turned on the landing, smashed the glass light fixture on the wall before pounding down the steps, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, leaving streaks of bright red blood where his fingers had touched the wall. Once he reached the bottom of the stairs, the killer raced for the front window, causing the wooden blinds to clatter as he jimmied himself through the opening and back out onto the front porch. This time, the smear of blood he left on the exterior aluminum siding was his own. At some point, he had cut himself, leaving a clear DNA marker alongside the window. A moment later, the killer had reached his car, yanked open the driver's side door, thrown the bloody knife onto the back seat, and headed for the freeway that would take him home. It's believed the killer either didn't know Lauren was still there at the property, or he simply was too panicked from all the screaming and chaos happening upstairs that he did not want to stick around any longer. Either way, Lauren was ultimately spared. Back at his apartment, the killer stripped off his blood-stained clothes and took them out to the backyard. Building a fire in the fire pit, he fed the clothes and his shoes into the bright orange flames. Later that same morning, when Lily Prudhomme heard the news that Leslie and Lily's own best friend Adrian had been murdered, Lily was absolutely heartbroken. And the one person who was there right from the start to help her cope with this terrible loss was her boyfriend and killer, Eric Koppel. It would turn out that Eric Koppel had been devastated when Lily had called off their wedding back in August of 2004. He knew he had a drinking problem, and he knew he suffered from deep depression, but to Eric, Lily was the most important person in his life, and he could not imagine living without her. Despite canceling their wedding, the two of them were still living together, and on Halloween, the two of them had gone to a party together, where Eric would start playing a drinking card game. But the more Eric drank at that party, the more he kept thinking that October 31st was just hours away from the day, November 1st, 2004, that should have been his wedding day. And instead of getting married to Eric, Lily had planned to spend what would have been their honeymoon on a trip not with him, but with her best friend Adrian, one of the people, Eric was sure of this, who had probably told Lily that she could do much better than Eric. But it wasn't until Eric had made one final plea that night, asking Lily again to marry him and set a new date for their wedding, that Eric's bitterness overflowed. Lily, angry at how intoxicated Eric was, said no to his marriage proposal, and when she drove him home that night, she didn't stay with him at their apartment. Instead, she went to her parents' house. As Eric Koppel would later tell police when he confessed to the double murder of Adrian and Leslie, he only remembered bits and pieces of what happened in the early hours of November 1st. He would never say exactly why he had killed the two women, and his own story of how he had committed the murders was different from the reconstruction police had put together based on forensic evidence and the autopsy reports on Leslie and Adrian. According to Eric, he had gone first to Adrian's room to lie down and sleep on a pile of blankets at the foot of her bed. When Adrian woke up, turned on the light, and saw Eric, he attacked her to keep her from crying out. And then, forgetting exactly how or why, Eric told police he had gone into Leslie's room and stabbed her too before running down the stairs and leaving by the front window. And after the murders, Eric had been such a comfort to Lily that 5 months later, the two of them were married in a ceremony that featured a special reading by none other than Adrian's mother, Arlene Allen. Eric made his confession to police on September 27th, 5 days after he had seen on TV the news story in which police linked the killer in the Halloween murders to a white male with light hair and eyes who smoked Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes. It was a brand that was so distinctive that when police had asked Lauren if she or Adrian or Leslie knew anyone who smoked Turkish Golds, Lauren was able to give investigators one name, Eric Koppel. Eric was one of the people who had helped Adrian move into the little house on Dorset Street back in February of 2004, 8 months before Adrian and Leslie were killed. And Eric was one of the only members of Adrian's inner circle who had never been questioned by police or asked for a DNA sample. By the time the news story about the cigarettes had aired, Eric could already feel the net tightening around him. He knew from earlier news coverage that police had recovered the killer's DNA from the scene and that the blood, saliva, tissue, and sweat were his. And as the killer's DNA profile came into clearer focus, a white male of Northern European descent with light hair and light eyes who smoked these Turkish Gold cigarettes, it was a face Eric recognized every time he looked into a mirror. After starting in late summer, before Turkish Gold cigarettes had made the headlines, police, acting on Lauren's tip, had already begun calling Eric. Until then, Eric had slipped below police radar. A quiet and religious 26-year-old land surveyor, he did not appear to have close personal ties with either Adrian or Leslie. And while police collected 218 DNA samples from men known to be among the victim's circle of friends and acquaintances, they did not collect any samples from Eric. When Eric arrived at the police station on September 27th, 11 months after he had killed Adrian and Leslie, he didn't come alone. After seeing the TV news story about the Turkish Gold cigarettes, Eric apparently wrote suicide letters to his family. In response to those letters, his family urged him to go to the police. And so when Eric walked alone into the police interrogation room, the family members who had accompanied him sat waiting for him in the lobby. Despite the differences between the police reconstruction of the crime and the story that Eric told them, Eric Koppel was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Adrian and Sonia and Leslie Mazzara. Police were very skeptical that Eric could be sober enough to plan and carry out 2 murders, stand outside his victim's house smoking cigarettes, and later destroy evidence of his crime, but also be so drunk that he was unable to remember actually stabbing and killing his victims, and unable to recall what he had done with the murder weapon, which was never found. On Tuesday, December 5th, 2006, just 2 months after the second anniversary of the Halloween murders, Eric Koppel pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. That guilty plea meant that the families of his victims would be spared a potentially painful jury trial, and it also meant that Eric would not face a possible death sentence. Instead, Eric was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving his time at Corcoran Prison, a correction center in California designed specifically to house inmates who have a substance abuse disorder. At Eric's sentencing, Adrian's best friend, Lily, told a packed courtroom there was nothing in the world that Eric could do to make her love him less. 2 years later, though, in 2008, the couple got a divorce. Later, Lily would enroll as a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where she would write a doctoral dissertation on forgiveness. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to pick up the Amazon Music follow button after their work shift is over. But don't show up, and instead just keep sending them periodic text messages that promise you are only 5 minutes away. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the fall of 2002, 19-year-old Gemma Houghton moved into her dorm room at the very prestigious University of Manchester in England to begin her freshman year. Her first couple of months at the school were relatively uneventful. She spent all of her time focusing on her studies, and so she really had not gone out and met any new people. But in early 2003, so about halfway through her freshman year, she was standing outside of her dorm when this boy she had never met before walked up to her and introduced himself. He was this tall, very handsome, very charming guy. He said his name was Ian Redmond. He was a senior at the school, and he in fact lived in the same building that she did, and so he just wanted to introduce himself. Now, Gemma was not looking for a boyfriend, but she was immediately attracted to Ian, and Ian would later say the feeling was mutual. This chance encounter would ultimately blossom into a full-fledged romantic relationship, one that would ultimately lead to Ian 6 years later proposing to Gemma on Christmas Eve 2009. That same year they got engaged, the couple, who had diligently saved money for years and years and years, were able to pool their money and buy a house together. It was not a very nice house. It was a fairly beat-up cottage in this little town in England that would need a lot of work, but Ian and Gemma were actually very excited to do the work. They looked at this as an opportunity to make the house exactly the way they wanted it, and it was a chance for them to spend some quality time together. So for the next 2 years, during all of their free time, Ian and Gemma would work on their home, and then finally in August of 2011, right before their actual wedding day, they finished the renovation. Their home is done. And so they get married, and then literally right after their wedding, instead of going right into a honeymoon, they just moved right into their dream home that night. And so for the next couple of days, the newlyweds got to enjoy being husband and wife for the first time inside of their dream home, and then it was time to go on the honeymoon. In addition to having set aside money for the down payment on their home, the couple had also set aside money for this honeymoon. They wanted it to be an amazing vacation. And so what they decided to do for their honeymoon was to go to Seychelles, which is this island nation in the Indian Ocean, which which many say has the most beautiful beaches in the world. So on August 10th, the couple hops on a plane and they fly to Seychelles. And when they land, they check into their resort, which is this unbelievable place that overlooks this perfect beach with white sand and crystal clear waters. And then after getting checked in, the couple goes down to a restaurant and they're having a bite to eat. And as they're sitting there, they're probably thinking to themselves, this is going to be the best vacation ever. During the first week of their trip, the couple was very active, spending lots of time exploring the island and going out on different excursions and going to lots of restaurants. They were just all over the place. And so come Tuesday, August 16th, which was the start of their second week and final week of this honeymoon, the couple was kind of tired from all the activity. And so they decided they would just have a lazy day at the beach that day. And so the couple grabbed their swimsuits and their towels and their chairs, and they left the resort and headed down to the beach right outside. And then after finding a decent spot on the sand, they set up their chairs and towels, put their stuff down. And Gemma, she laid down on one of the chairs to begin sunbathing. And Ian, he grabbed his fins and his snorkel, and he kissed Gemma on the cheek and said he was going to go down to the water and go for a swim. Gemma remembers watching Ian as he walked across the beach and stopped in front of the water and put on his big fins and got his snorkel on, and then he kind of awkwardly duck walked his way into the water. And Gemma remembers just smiling and laughing to herself watching him awkwardly do this, and then thinking to herself how lucky she was to be married to such an amazing guy. She really loved him so much. After Ian had finally gotten into the water and had begun his snorkeling journey, Gemma laid back and began to doze off to sleep. A little while later, though, Gemma suddenly woke up to the sound of what almost sounded like someone sneezing really, really loudly. And so instinctively, she sat up and scanned the waterline for her husband, but all she saw were other tourists in the water swimming and snorkeling and doing all sorts of stuff. She couldn't find Ian. And then she heard a male voice calling out for help, and it was coming off to the right towards the top of the beach, pretty far away from her. And she turned and she saw Ian. Ian was about 60 feet off of the sand, so he's well out into the water, and he appeared to be kind of hunched forward with his arm kind of in the water, and he's waving his other arm in the air. It was like he was stuck on something, and before Gemma could get up and run to him or help him in any way, Ian just begins to scream at the top of his lungs. When Ian began screaming, there was a surgeon who was also on vacation at this beach, who was in a boat near where Ian was. He hears the scream and he boats over to Ian, and he and the guy who was in the boat with him managed to pull Ian out of the water. They get him on the boat, and Ian is alive and he's conscious, but he is missing his entire left arm. He's missing the majority of his left thigh, and there was a huge chunk missing from his midsection. It would turn out Ian had been attacked by a bull shark, one of the most aggressive sharks in the world. That sneezing sound that Gemma had heard that had startled her awake was the sound Ian had made through his snorkel when the shark bit down on him. The surgeon rushed Ian to the shore and pulled him out and got him onto the sand and began trying to save his life. At the same time, Gemma had come running up the beach, and she managed to push through the quickly forming crowd, and she drops down next to her husband. And Ian at this point is alive and he's conscious. He's very badly hurt, but he's looking up and he's clearly making eye contact with Gemma. And Gemma, she's looking down at her husband and she's making clear eye contact with him. And they don't really say much. It was like this horrible moment where all they could do was just be in the moment together. And so during this kind of silent acknowledgement, Ian would ultimately pass away. It would turn out, over the past few weeks, there had been a rash of shark attacks at this beach, including one other fatal attack on another tourist. Because shark attacks in Seychelles were so unheard of, they believed this had to be the work of one rogue bull shark. That was the one shark that was doing all of these attacks. And so because this shark had not been captured or killed, the country had actually instituted a temporary ban on swimming at this beach and a few other beaches. But for whatever reason, the ban had not been communicated effectively to the tourists, nor had it been enforced on the tourists. And so Gemma and Ian had no idea the water was a dangerous place to be. They just looked out and saw other tourists swimming around and believed it was totally safe, when in reality, it obviously wasn't. Gemma would quickly return to England, and she would host her husband's funeral in the same church she and he had been married in 10 days earlier. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Current. Have you ever felt like everyone around you has a weirdly deep understanding of their personal finances? They're investing in the stock market, they have 401ks and Roth IRAs, they're buying up crypto and NFTs and Ethereum, they got all this stuff going on, and you're like, I have a bank account? If that's you, then you're like me. And if you're like me, you really need to sign up for Current. Imagine a company that could drastically simplify your personal finances. They could help you save money, they could earn you points on your purchases, and on top of that, they have a very slick mobile app. Well, the company you're thinking of would be Current. They are not only designed for the not financial gurus like myself, they are also designed for the future. Right now, virtually every bank requires you, at least at some point, to come into their physical location, despite the fact we're in 2021, about to go into 2022, where everything is online, but banks have not evolved. Current, on the other hand, they have evolved. Their entire operation is online. Once you sign up, they fire you off one of these sweet little debit cards, but then everything else is done on their app. Current and I are also giving away $10,000 to you all. All you gotta do is sign up for Current using my promo code BALLEN, and then you could be one of 20 people who wins $500. So go sign up now. Okay, back to the stories. In 1986, 35 million Americans went to see the brand new movie Crocodile Dundee, which was a comedy that starred this very capable and rugged Australian crocodile hunter who goes to New York City. One of the 35 million Americans who saw this film was a 24-year-old model from Virginia named Ginger Meadows. And after seeing this film, Ginger felt inspired to actually go to Australia to see it for herself because it looked so amazing in this movie. So a couple of months later, in March of 1987, Ginger, by herself, hops on a plane and flies to Perth, which is a major city in Western Australia. And her plan was she would land in Australia and then work odd jobs to make a little bit of cash, and then use that cash to fund her travels all over the country. And then at some point, after she was tired of doing that, she would head back to the United States. So she lands in Perth, and immediately she sees her first opportunity to make some money. There had been this huge sailing competition in the city leading up to the weekend she arrived there. And so she saw all these luxury yachts anchored at all these docks along the coastline. And Ginger's thinking to herself, you know, these huge ships, they have crews that work on them basically full time. Maybe one of these boats could use an extra set of hands. And so Ginger, who was very friendly and outgoing, she went right down to one of these docks and she stopped in front of the very first yacht she saw, which was this huge luxury 100-foot yacht. And she introduced herself to the captain of this boat. And she said, hey, you know, can I hitch a ride with you guys to the next place you're going? And in exchange, I'll work for you. And as it happened, the captain was actually looking for another crew member to assist their chef. And so he said, okay, well, can you cook? And Ginger said, yeah, I'm a great cook. And he said, okay, well, you're hired. You can be the chef's assistant. And so Ginger, she climbs on board and she meets the rest of the 5 other crew members, including the chef who she'd be working with. And the chef's name was Jane, and those two would become very close. And then shortly after Ginger had come aboard, the captain cast off their lines and they headed out to sea. Their next stop was going to be New Guinea, which was roughly 14 days of travel away. After about a week at sea, the captain realized they were dangerously low on fresh water. And so he decided to take a detour and turn east and head inland along this river system that would bring them to this large freshwater pool, which he also knew had this huge waterfall that dumped down into it. And so he figured they could go right underneath this waterfall and fill up their jugs with all this fresh water and then head back out and they'd be good. So on the morning of March 29th, the captain anchored the yacht out at sea near the mouth of this river system, and then he lowered the yacht's dinghy, which was a smaller, more agile boat. And once that was in the water, he, Ginger, Jane, and the rest of the crew, they hop in this dinghy along with all these large empty water jugs, and they begin making their way towards this river. And so they're traveling up this river for a little while, and then finally they get to this huge freshwater freshwater pool, and right in front of them is this amazing waterfall, and everybody is just totally awestruck by this waterfall. It's like a gem in the middle of nowhere, because they're in very rugged Australia at this point. And so the captain, he brings the dinghy right near the base of the waterfall, and one by one they hold up their water jugs and they fill them with fresh water, and then they're about to turn and go back out to sea and get back on their yacht when the captain thinks to himself, you know what, we've been at sea for 7 days straight, it's been very monotonous, maybe it would be a good thing to stick around here for a little bit longer and maybe even hike up to the top of this waterfall and enjoy the view and kind of enjoy the scenery before we head back out to sea. And so he says to his crew, hey, do you guys want to go to the top of this waterfall? And everyone agrees it's a great idea, with the exception of Jane. She did not feel like hiking to the top of this waterfall. She said she would stay down in the dinghy and wait for them. Now, this pool is basically surrounded on all sides by just pure cliff face. There really is no place to land this dinghy. There's no flat surfaces. You basically have cliffs that go directly into water, and then also you have the river that feeds back out to the ocean. So the captain brings the dinghy right up against the cliff face right next to this waterfall, and he and Ginger and the other crew members not named Jane climb out of the dinghy onto this cliff face, and they begin climbing, literally climbing up this wall towards the top of the waterfall. Now, everyone was able to do it except for Ginger. She kept slipping on the rocks. It was very steep. It seemed kind of dangerous. And so at some point, she abandons the idea and goes back down to the dinghy with Jane, and the captain and the rest of the crew, they continue up towards the top. And so as Ginger and Jane are sitting in the dinghy watching the other crew members making their way up, they start feeling a little bit left out, and they're like, you know what, let's try to find an alternate way up to the top of this waterfall. And so they begin scanning out across this pool at the other cliffs kind of surrounding it, and it looked like on the very other side of the pool there was a less severe cliff face that maybe they would have an easier time climbing up. And so the two women, they jump into the murky brown water and begin swimming directly across this pool towards this other cliff. And when they make it about a third of the way, Jane suddenly stops, and Ginger notices and turns around and looks at Jane, and she's like, what's going on? And Jane would tell her, you know, something just feels off. This doesn't feel right. Let's go back to the dinghy. Let's just forget about this. But Ginger is like, come on, we're so close. Let's just keep going. It'll be awesome once we get to the top of this waterfall. And so Jane, she's totally hesitant, but she says, okay, fine. And they both continue to swim. And then all of a sudden, they hear their captain, who is now on top of the waterfall, screaming down to them to get out of the water right now. And they notice he is pointing down at the pool in a direction slightly away from where they were. And so they're looking up at him, and they're following his finger down to the part of the pool he's pointing at, and they see there is this tidal wave of water coming towards them. It is a 12-foot long saltwater crocodile that has noticed them, and it is charging straight at them. Now, Jane and Ginger knew they were too far away from the dinghy to be able to swim to it before this crocodile was going to reach them, and so their next best choice was just to turn and swim towards the nearest cliff face, because again, there is no place to get out of the water. There's only cliffs. And so they swim towards this cliff face, which is right on the edge of the bottom of the waterfall, and so water is landing on them, and they reach the cliff face, and they're trying to climb up and pull themselves out of the water, but there's nowhere to grab onto. It's all totally slick. There's no good handholds, and so all they have is this little ledge that is in the water that they're standing on, but they're still halfway into the water. And so after they struggle for a minute trying to pull themselves out of the water, and they realize they can't do it, they both just turn around and they lock arms and they look out through the water that's falling down in front of them into the pool, and they see this crocodile has followed them, and it is now stopped right on the other side of the water that's falling down, and it's just staring at them with its mouth wide open. And the two women are looking at it. They don't know what to do. And the captain and the other crew members, they see what's going on, and they're trying to climb down as fast as they possibly can to try to rescue them. But it's going to take several minutes at least before they get down to the dinghy. And so Jane and Ginger, they're totally aware of this, and they're just staring at this crocodile, screaming at it, trying to get it to go away. And at some point, the crocodile does just close its mouth and sink below the surface. But now they don't know where it is, and this causes Ginger to completely panic, and she lets go of Jane's arm, and she dives into the water off to the right and attempts to swim away from the crocodile back over to the boat. But Ginger only made it 2 strokes before the crocodile suddenly re-emerged underneath her and grabbed her by the waist and pulled her under the water. Jane is just standing there watching all of this happen in front of her. She has no idea what to do. The crew is still not down in the dinghy, so she's totally stranded, and she's just staring at the area where Ginger has been pulled below the surface. And just seconds after she's been pulled under, the crocodile re-emerges with its head pointed towards Jane, and in its jaws is Ginger. And Ginger's got her arms up over her head. She's wide-eyed, and she's looking right at Jane. And Jane makes eye contact with her, but there's nothing she can do. And she just watched as Ginger again was pulled back under, and this time she did not come up again. Ultimately, Jane would be rescued from the ledge. The crew would get down to the dinghy, they'd swing over, they would pick her up, and then about 2 days later, they would find what was left of Ginger's remains. It would turn out the captain was well aware of the threat the crocodiles posed in this river, and he had told his crew, Ginger and Jane included, about this threat, and that at no point should anyone get in this water. But of course, his warning went unheeded. If you Google the words Burning Man and you click on images, you'll see lots of scantily clad and somewhat wild-looking people roaming around the Nevada desert on strange-looking bikes, and in the background, you'll see all these huge, bizarre statues of aliens and robots and animals, and these statues are often draped in more wild-looking people, or these statues are on fire, and these wild-looking people are dancing and rejoicing all around the flames. Based on these images, you might think Burning Man is just some totally weird substance-fueled party out in the middle of the desert. And while that is true to some degree, it's not totally accurate. Burning Man is not a party. It's actually an experiment that 70,000 people from all over the world participate in every year. The question this experiment is trying to answer is, can a random segment of the population come together and build a community out of nothing in the middle of nowhere? And can they do it while knowing at the end of Burning Man, which is always 9 days long, everything they build, the sculptures, the shelters, everything will be torn down and destroyed and erased from the planet as if it had never been there in the first place. And amazingly, year after year after year, the answer to this question is yes. Yes, they can. As soon as these 70,000 people descend on this small section of the Nevada desert, they immediately get to work helping each other, building their own sites. I mean, these people largely don't know each other, or in many cases, they don't even speak the same language, but they're showing up with this shared desire to build this temporary community. And so they begin seamlessly working together. And while shelters are being stood up all over the place, other attendees will pull out instruments and form impromptu bands, and then the artists of the group will get together and begin building these kind of strange sculptures. And so very quickly, within only a few hours, every year in Burning Man, this plot of barren desert turns into this beautiful otherworldly utopia full of totally happy and fulfilled and excited strangers. But in 2017, the utopia that was created at that Burning Man was shattered by one man, and his name was Aaron Joel. In 2017, Aaron Joel was a tall, handsome, 41-year-old free spirit who, from the time he was just a little kid, had this sort of restless energy about him. He always needed to be out doing stuff. He could never sit still. And so by the time he was old enough, he left his family home in Oklahoma and moved out to Oregon and moved into this commune. A commune is a group of people that live together and share their possessions and responsibilities. But shortly after moving into this commune, Aaron got restless again. This wasn't enough for him, and so he left the commune and began traveling all over the United States. But after he had basically gone everywhere in the country, he became restless again, and so he left the United States and he went to Nepal and began traveling all over Nepal. And while he was there, he met this wonderful young woman from Switzerland named Ladina, and the two fell madly in love. And then when it was time for Ladina to leave Nepal and go back to her home country, Aaron followed her. And just a couple of years later, in 2014, the pair got married and they bought a house together and settled down in Switzerland. For a time, Aaron and Ladina were very happy. Their life was very simple and straightforward. They loved each other. They loved Switzerland. But in 2017, Aaron's wanderlust reared its head again. And so he went up to Ladina and he told her that, honey, I need to go out and explore again. I need to go out and be free again, even if it's just for a couple of days or a week or whatever time it is. I need it. I need it in order to be sane. I don't think Ladina was very pleased about this development. However, she knew her husband and she knew this was important to him and to his mental health. And so she said, okay, honey, you do what you have to do. And so Aaron thought about what he was going to do to satiate this desire to go out and be free again. And he settled on attending that year's Burning Man, something he had never done before. So Aaron leaves Switzerland and he goes back to Oregon in the United States. And he meets up with a very close friend of his named Justin. Justin was actually someone he had lived with in the commune when he was there. And so the two, they link up in Oregon. And from there, they drive in Justin's big van out to Nevada. And when they get to Nevada, they drive out to the Burning Man site. And as they're pulling up, they see thousands and thousands of other vans and tents and all these people that are out setting up and building this community, this utopia. And so right away, Aaron and Justin, they find their spot, they park their van, they begin to build their own site. And then after that, they pulled their bikes out of the van and began biking around, helping other people out build their sites and build the rest of the community. And so by that afternoon, Aaron and Justin had made lots of new friends and they were out partying and dancing and singing with total strangers, just totally immersed in the Burning Man experience. That night, Aaron would actually turn in early while Justin would stay up and continue having a good time with the new people he had met. Aaron was just not a night owl. He liked to get a full night's sleep and then get up early and make himself a smoothie and do yoga. And so this was very normal behavior. Justin would later say that he really looked up to Aaron. And in fact, many people that knew Aaron looked up to him because Aaron, on the one hand, was a total free spirit that would just kind of go where the wind would blow him. But at the same time, he was very regimented and disciplined. He took great care of himself, both physically and mentally, and he just seemed wise beyond his years. And he was incredibly charismatic and very funny, and so people really flocked to him and really idolized him. One of the traditions of Burning Man has to do with its namesake. Towards the end of every Burning Man, they will build this 40-foot tall wooden man effigy, and they will burn it to the ground, hence the name Burning Man. And so on the night of the so-called man burn, Aaron told Justin that he was not going to turn in early that night, that instead he was going to stay up and watch the spectacle of this effigy being burned to the ground. Justin was really excited about it, and so was Aaron. And so that evening, Aaron and Justin met up with their new friends they had met while they were at Burning Man, and their group began making their way over to the wooden man effigy. Now, this huge effigy was situated in this huge open clearing, and then standing all around this wooden man are what they called rangers. They're basically security guards for the event that also have some fire training, and they would stand almost shoulder to shoulder or very close to shoulder, facing away from the effigy, forming a perimeter around it. And the rangers' job was to prevent the crowd of 70,000 people from getting too close to the effigy when it was on fire, because it's obviously a huge hazard. And so Aaron, Justin, and their friends, when they got to this clearing and saw the effigy, they would have seen thousands and thousands of event attendees converging on this effigy, getting as close to the rangers as they possibly could on all sides. And so Aaron and Justin and their friends, they make their way up to one particular section of this crowd, and they begin fighting their way through all these people, trying to get as close to the rangers as they possibly could because they want a good view of this man burn. And then once they were satisfied with their view, they just stopped and waited for the effigy to be lit. But before the effigy was lit, Aaron would turn to Justin and say, hey, I have some friends from Switzerland who are here right now. They're on the other side of the effigy, on the other side of the crowd, and I'm going to go see them right now. And so Justin was totally bummed that Aaron was going to be leaving right before this thing is lit because he wanted to experience this with Aaron. But he said, okay, no problem. I'll see you hopefully, before this thing gets lit, or, I'll see you after this burn is done. And so Aaron departed the group and Justin watched as he kind of disappeared into the crowd. And then Justin turned his attention back back towards the effigy. And a little while later, when the sun had gone down and it was totally dark out and the crowd was totally electric as they're waiting for this thing to light, finally they did. They lit the effigy. And as soon as it went up in flames, the crowd of thousands and thousands of people roared with excitement. And this whole time, Justin is totally amazed by what he is watching, but he's also scanning the crowd, kind of hoping that Aaron will eventually pop back up. But at this point, the crowd is so massive and everyone's so tight together that Justin is really not expecting Aaron to come back over to where he had been. It just didn't seem possible. And so this huge wooden man effigy goes up in glorious flames and everyone's so amazed by it. And then eventually the flames begin to dwindle down as the structure continues to burn lower and lower to the ground. And then finally, when the fire is just about out, the crowd of people begin to disperse. And at this point, Justin again looks around hoping to maybe see Aaron, but Aaron has not come back yet. And so Justin just says, okay, maybe it's time to leave and go check in with Aaron back at the van. And so he notifies his friends that he's going to turn around and head back. And as Justin turns and begins leaving the crowd, someone who was at the event, who apparently knew Justin and knew Aaron, came running over to Justin and frantically told him this totally shocking story about something that happened to Aaron. Now, at first, Justin just could not believe it. He couldn't even process it. It seemed so outlandish and unbelievable that it just could not have happened. But he was thinking to himself, I haven't seen Aaron since he left to go see his friends from Switzerland, and I have no idea where he is. And so Justin starts looking around the crowd again. He's not seeing Aaron, and he's starting to panic. And so finally, Justin just turns and starts running back towards his van in hopes that Aaron is going to be there. But when he gets back to his van, Aaron is not there, and there's no sign that Aaron has been back after they had left for the man burn. It would turn out that shocking story Justin had been told about Aaron was true. This is that shocking story. After Aaron told Justin that he was going to go to the other side of the crowd and spend some time with his friends from Switzerland, he disappeared from the group and he made his way over to that far side of the crowd. But we don't know if he actually met up with friends from Switzerland or if that was just some cover to get away from Justin and the other people he was with. But regardless, at some point, Aaron made his way over to the other side of the effigy, away from Justin and away from his other friends. And once he was over there, he pushed his way towards the front of the crowd until he was right in front of the Rangers with front row seats of the effigy. And then after the effigy was set alight and was fully engulfed in flames, Aaron, at some point, bum rushed one of the Rangers right in front of him and was able to push past him. And then before that Ranger or any other nearby Rangers could stop him, Aaron was able to sprint directly into the bottom of this massive effigy, right into the fire, and he disappeared inside of it. Because the crowd was massive and unruly and many people were under the influence of drugs or alcohol or both, because of all of that, even though Aaron is running into the fire right in front of them, it was like nobody noticed. Everybody was in kind of their own worlds, and it's dark out, there's this fire. I mean, there's so many distractions that really nobody noticed this happening besides the Rangers that were immediately affected by Aaron running past them and some of the people that were right at the front of the crowd watching as Aaron did this. And so this is why Justin and the rest of his friends had no idea this had happened, despite the fact they were watching this fire as this was happening. Aaron would ultimately only be inside of the flames for 12 seconds before the Rangers were able to go inside and pull him out. But by that time, it was already too late. Aaron would be rushed to the hospital, but he would die that night. It would later be determined that Aaron was completely sober at the time he decided to run into the burning man, which means he was of clear mind when he decided to do this. And so it was determined that his death had to be a suicide. However, his family and his friends and anybody who knew him are just totally not buying the idea that he decided to commit suicide, especially like this. It just didn't make any sense. This is not something Aaron would have done. He was acting totally normally. His behavior was not erratic. Something else must have caused this to happen. But unfortunately, at this point, no one has come close to figuring out what this other thing could be. And so to date, his death still remains largely a mystery. Here is a picture one of the bystanders took of Aaron as he charges into the fire. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp.